Hey y'all, it is a little bit early on Wednesday afternoon. Just want to let you know I'm trying to go live this afternoon. I'm preaching in Arkansas this evening and want to try to go ahead and get my lesson uh, out there in internet land, get it posted to Facebook, hopefully to YouTube. And so wanted to go ahead and get started with those matters today. It's a joy to be with you as always, and I appreciate all those that watch the live stream, watch later on. Our subject matter today is a question that I have received on a number of different occasions, and the title of, if you can see on the live stream, that our title is "Why do good things happen to, or why do bad things happen to good people? Why do bad things happen to good people?" And it's a very difficult question. There's absolutely there's no doubt about that. And I'll just be honest with you, the times in the past when I've received that question, it has really caught me off guard. I'll just give you one example. We were coming home from Ghana, probably at least 15 years ago now, and we were coming through one of the customs areas, and I might have been in Chicago, might have been in London. I don't recall, but they were asking us about what we did for, why we were traveling, what do we do for a living, and whatnot. And when I told this young lady that I was a gospel preacher, right there on the spot, she starts asking me about why do bad things happen to good people. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, look, lady, I just want to get through this line and get my luggage. But of course, I entertained her question, and I did my best to answer it. I'll just be honest with you, I don't think I did a very good job. One, because I was caught off guard, and two, because I really hadn't spent enough time studying the matter to formulate a clear and concise answer to the question. And by the way, this is really not a question that can be answered off the cuff or in a moment's notice. It's one of those things where there's a book by I believe it's Greg Calkle, and in that book he talks about putting a stone in someone's shoe. In other words, there are situations where you can't answer a question in its fullest need, but you can put a thought in someone's mind that will stay with them like a rock in their shoe, and it's something that they can't get out of their minds. And so this is probably one of those questions. And one thing, you have to make a very quick determination as to what the intent is of the person who is asking it. The young lady that asked me the question, I don't think was trying to be rude. I don't think she was trying to be mean. I do think that she was probably an atheist or an agnostic, an unbeliever in the purest sense of the word. And she was asking me this question out of a sincere desire, a sincere place in her heart, in her mind. And I guess I didn't have a good answer for her. And she gave, because she gave me this little scenario about something that had happened to someone that she knew, and this person was a very good person, and they were religious, and they did this, and then some animal, and when I mean animal, I mean a really bad human being, did something terrible and caused the death of this individual. And I was talking with Billy about it because he'd come through in a different line, and I was talking to him about it, and he said something to me that has always stuck with me. In other words, I wish I'd had Billy standing right behind me in this line, and Bill made the statement. He says, "If there is no God, then why is she offended at what happened?" And I thought, man, that's a really good response. That I could have asked her, because she was trying to put me on the spot, but I don't believe in a mean way. But an adequate response would have been at that time, well, if there is no God, as it appears that you're trying to make that case, then why are you offended at what happened to this person? Why by what determination do you say, well, this is a good person and this is a bad person, and a bad person did something and a good person suffered, and that's a bad thing. And the infidel, the unbeliever, the skeptic, however you want to describe him, has a difficult time drawing moral conclusions. Now, in their own minds, they'll draw all kinds of moral conclusions, but without an objective, source or an objective foundation of right and wrong, there is no right and wrong. It turns into subjective, what is right and what is wrong to the individual. And so I thought what Bill said was really, really good. Like I said, I wish I'd had him closer when the question came, but that's but that's just one response of many that one might offer. And but I want us to think about some things today with respect to this question. Why do bad things happen to good people? And sometimes we would ask the question, why don't bad things happen to bad people? And that's been a question for literally thousands of years. Job is generally regarded as the oldest book of the Bible. In other words, it was written before any of the other books. Now don't ask me how it survived the flood or anything like that. I'm just saying, in scholarly circles, Job is considered to be the oldest book of the Bible. Of course, Moses wrote from the very beginning, about the very beginning of the creation, but Moses, wrote over 2,000 years removed from those events. But but the point I'm getting at is that Job wondered the same thing. In Job chapter 21, I'm just going to read just a couple of paragraphs out of Job and one out of Psalm, maybe a very brief reading out of Jeremiah. But in Job 21, all these things have happened to Job. And by the way, and we know the story of Job. He did his very best to be a good person, and not just a good person, a godly person. He offered sacrifice. He offered sacrifice for his 10 children. Basically, in the event my children have sinned, here's a sacrifice on their behalf. A man who was obviously loved and respected by many, who are perhaps all who knew him. And Job, after all of the tragedies and the calamities had befallen him, he says in Job 21, beginning of verse 7, "Why do the wicked live and become old? Yes, become mighty in power. Their descendants are established with them in their sight, and their offspring before their eyes." In other words, they get to see their children and their children's children and so forth. "Their houses are safe from fear. Neither is the rod of God upon them. Their bulls breed without failure. Cows calve without miscarriage. They send forth their little ones like a flock. Their children dance. They sing to the tambourine and harp and rejoice to the sound of the flute. They spend their days in wealth, and in a moment go down to the grave. Yet they say to God, 'Depart from us, for we do not desire the knowledge of your ways.' Who is the Almighty that we should serve him? And what profit do we have if we pray to him? Indeed, their prosperity is not in their hand. The counsel of the wicked is far from me." And so Job is wondering about why wicked people live to be extended ages. He's wondering why their lives are not only marked by longevity, but that they are also marked by prosperity. And I'm going to I want you to focus just for a moment to think about that they spend their days in wealth and in a moment go down to the grave. We're going to come back to that thought in just a few moments. And so, Job pondered this question for a long time ago. David also asked many of the same questions in Psalm 73, 1 through 9. And you'll see me moving my head back and forth. I forgot to print this lesson out before I brought it, and I'm out of town, so I'm having to actually use my screen as my outline, and so you'll see me glancing back and forth. But David in Psalm 73, and beginning in verse number 1. All right, we'll just say verse 3. He says, I was envious of the boastful when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. For there are no pangs in their death, but their strength is firm. They are not in trouble as other men. Therefore pride serves as their necklace. Violence covers them like a garment. Their eyes bulge with abundance. They have more than heart could wish. Yet they scoff and speak wickedly concerning oppression. They speak loftily. They set their mouths against the heavens, and their tongue walks through the earth. And so David, again, wondering about the prosperity and the apparent blessings that seem to fall upon the wicked. And again, like Job, David says there are no pangs in their death. And so I want to again hold on to that, just like with Job, what Job said. Just while we're thinking along these lines, Jeremiah asked the question in Jeremiah 12, beginning in verse number 1. He says, righteous are you, O Lord, when I plead with you, yet let me talk with you about your judgments. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? And why are those happy who deal so treacherously? You have planted them, and they have taken root. They grow and bear fruit. You are near in their mouth, but far from their mind. And so Jeremiah, again, expresses many of the same thoughts of both Job and David with regard to the prosperity of the wicked. And so this is not a new question. It is a difficult question. And so we want to just look at some things about, why do bad things happen to good people? What are some of the causes, for example, of life's difficulties? And of course, going back to the example of the young lady at the airport, she didn't believe in God, but she wanted to blame God for the trouble that had befallen the individual that she had in mind. And we ask the question, is God the source of my difficulty? And we can go back to the book of Job, and we can read chapter 1, where Satan was given license to afflict Job, financially speaking, and with regard to his family, that he lost his flocks, he lost his herds, he lost his servants, he lost his children. And yet Job, did not offend God with his mouth. He did not curse God, or he did not in any way sin with his lips. And yet people would have assumed, as Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar did, that Job was a vile sinner. He must have committed some heinous, grievous sin. The question was asked, who do you know who suffered as much as you, Job, and not because of their own sin? Trying to build a case of sin against Job because of the calamity that had befallen him. Of course, then in Job chapter 2, we find that Satan is given license and authority to deal with Job with regard to his health. And Job was struck with boils from the top of his head to the soles of his feet. If you've ever had a boil, and I've had just one boil, and extremely painful, and one can only imagine the torturous existence of being covered in boils. And as the Bible says that Job, he rent his clothes, and he scraped himself with old pieces of broken pottery in order to try to find relief from the boils that he'd been with which he'd been afflicted. And so, but again, Job did not sin with his mouth, even though his wife said, "Do you still retain your integrity? Curse God and die." And Job said, "You speak as a foolish woman. Shall we accept good at the hand of the Lord and not accept evil?" And so, but I think Job understood that God was not the source of his difficulty, but yet at the same time, Job was wondering why God was allowing these things to happen to him. Of course, we always have to remember, we're blessed to be able to read the book of Job from a distance. In other words, we get to see the whole picture laid out before us. Whereas, as it's recorded in the book, we're having it's a running narrative of Job's difficulties and the exchanges between his friends, and then obviously at the end the restoration of his wealth and children. And so, but we understand from the outset that God is not the source of Job's difficulties. Satan was the source of Job's difficulties. James chapter 1, although it's speaking about sin, I think it's still fair to say, let no man say when he is tempted, blessed is the man that endures temptation. When he is tried, he will receive the crown of life that does not fade away. Let no man say when he's tempted, I'm tempted of God. For God does not tempt men to sin. God cannot be tempted with sin, neither does he tempt any man. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13, God is faithful and will with any and every temptation provide a way of escape that we might be able to bear it. So we want to understand from the outset that God is not the source of our temptation. God is not the source of our difficulties. And yet sometimes we want to blame God for our difficulties because God has not prevented them. And we have to, again, need to step back and look at, for example, look at just the subject of parenting. Do we not sometimes allow our children to experience pain and suffering, because even though we might have been able to prevent it, because we know that in the long run that it's going to help them? We need to allow our children to fail. Too many parents, and this has been going on for a number of years now. Too many parents think that their children are too good to fail. They're too smart to fail. They're too smart not to get all A's. He's too good of an athlete to sit the bench, or she's too good of an athlete to sit the bench. He should have been captain. It's just one thing after another, and when the child fails or does not meet expectations or hopes, then we're going to blame somebody else. We're going to blame the system. You know how it is. Certain people get what they want, and the rest of us, we get the leftovers. We're gonna blame the system. We're gonna blame people. We're gonna blame other kids. There's all these excuses. In other words, we're not gonna allow them to truly experience failure, because we're going to make an excuse for them, and pacify and salve that failure. And we don't do our children any favors when we do that. They need to experience failure, even though there are times when we could prevent failure. For example, a child. Let's just say a child doesn't has a homework assignment, and they've been given 2 weeks to get it done, and then of course the night before the assignment's due. You know what? You might be able to help them with that assignment and get it done the night before, but what you need to do is you need to let them get whatever done they can and turn in whatever sloppy work they provide, and let them suffer the consequences of their actions. And so we understand, when we put it in those terms, hopefully we can understand how important it is to allow our children to fail, and to not get everything they want all the time, and then we see the long-term good. Well, in the same sense, just because God doesn't prevent failure or pain in our life doesn't mean that God doesn't care about us, but it also doesn't mean God's the source of it. Like I said, if my kids put off an assignment until the last day and they turn in shoddy work, I could have prevented that. But that's not my place. In other words, they've got to learn, and you can't blame me if my kids don't do what they're supposed to do. And I'm talking about older kids. I'm not talking about little kids that need to be handled and disciplined and whatnot. But and so we have to have a proper view of God with regard to our difficulties. And so first of all, we want to establish God's not the source of our difficulties. Secondly, we need to look inside. We need to focus on ourselves. Say, am I the cause of my difficulty? In other words, is it something that I have done that is the cause of my difficulty? For example, Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden. If there were ever any two people who had it made, they had it made. They lived. They lived in a garden of perfection, and they ruined it. And the only source of blame was themselves. Now, Adam blamed Eve, and Eve blamed the serpent, but God wasn't buying it. God, knew that they had a choice. They had a choice to obey Him, or they had a choice to be tempted and to follow their lusts, their inordinate desires, and allow Satan to influence them. But God punished them, and from that time forward, there was pain in childbirth. That Adam was going to have to eat his bread in the sweat of his brow, and that rather than simply to tend a garden that was going to provide for his every need, he was going to have to till the ground, and he's going to have to fight thorns and briars from here on out. And Adam lived 930 years. And so, this thing went on for a long time. And every day Adam had to be reminded, every time Adam had to go hoe the garden to get the weeds out, he was reminded, there was a time when I didn't have to do this. And it's my fault that I'm in the shape that I'm in. So Adam and Eve were the source of their difficulties. The Israelites who wandered the wilderness for 40 years, they tried to blame Moses. They tried to blame everybody under the sun. It was their fault. The people listened to the 10 wicked spies, and they suffered because of their own unbelief. Moses himself suffered because of his own sin. When God said to speak to the rock, Moses struck the rock. Moses had been instructed to strike a rock earlier, but his instructions this time were speak to the rock. And rather than do what God said, he did what he did before in a fit of anger, and it cost him the promised land. And by the way, Moses didn't go quietly about that matter. You can read early in the book of Deuteronomy that Moses apparently kind of pestered God about this thing, and let me go. And finally God said, look, I'm going to let you see it from the mountaintop, but you're not going in, and I don't want to hear another word about it. And that's the way it was. And when God carried him up, took him up on the mountain, Mount Nebo, and he saw, and God, I think in a miraculous way, led him to see the entirety of the promised land. And when Moses saw it, he died. And so but he didn't enter in because of his own sin. And all the people before him from age 20 and up didn't enter in because of their own sin. Of course, the families of Joshua and Caleb were accepted, were the exceptions in that matter. And so, their sin caused their difficulty. We think about David, the sin of David with Bathsheba was the source of a lifetime of difficulty. As he said, the man should repay fourfold, and David himself lived to fulfill the words of his own mouth. He repaid fourfold in four great personal tragedies. And so, and David couldn't point the finger at anybody. David couldn't point the finger at anybody but God for the difficulties. Or couldn't point the finger at God at anybody but himself. Well, that was a major mistake. Couldn't point the finger at anyone but himself for his difficulties. He couldn't blame God for the problems that he had. Asa was a great king in Judah in 2 Chronicles 16. And Asa was a good king, but then at the end of his life, he became an apostate, and he became diseased in his feet. And rather than seek the Lord to heal him and to recover him, he sought the doctors. He sought other men, and he didn't get what he wanted. His disease was likely a result of his apostasy, And his continued suffering was because of his own unbelief and his lack of faith in God, or his lack of pursuit of God. And so Asa's sins, were the result of, or Asa's difficulties were the result of his sins. And I have a note here. It says, my difficulties may be my own doing, but may they never be my undoing. In other words, I should never allow the consequences of my own sins to turn my heart against God. It really should serve to turn my heart to God to a greater degree. So, we suffer, first of all, because of our own sins. And secondly, we suffer because of the sins of others. I think about Jacob. And Jacob thought that Joseph was dead, and he said, "I'll go to my grave mourning my son." And you think about all the years that Jacob suffered because of the lie. We can call it whatever, but his sons lied to him. They presented Joseph's coat as if he had been killed by a wild animal. They knew he hadn't been killed by a wild animal. They let their dad believe he'd been killed. They led him to believe he'd been killed by a wild animal, and they never set the record straight. They lied to him. And they sinned against Joseph, and they sinned against their father, and their father suffered, and Joseph suffered because of the sins of the sons of Jacob. Aaron suffered because of the sins of others, specifically in Leviticus 10, verses 1 through 3, that his sons, Nadab and Abihu, were struck dead by God because they perverted the worship. They perverted the worship of the Lord. And when God struck them dead, through Moses, he commanded Aaron, "Do not rend your clothes. Do not tear your garments over these boys." In other words, you're not even allowed to mourn their loss, because they are dead because they did not consider me, sanctify me, and consider me as being holy. But Aaron suffered because his sons died, but his sons died because of their own sin. Therefore, Aaron suffered because of the sins of others. So many other examples we could mention. I think about the Galileans in Luke 13. That said that they talked to Jesus about the blood of the Galileans that Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices, and so Pilate was a horrible person, and killed some people, innocent people, and people suffered, but yet they were not to blame. They were not at fault. Ultimately, the ultimate example of this is Jesus. Isaiah 53 and Matthew 26, that Jesus suffered because of our sins, and not because of any sins or any wrongdoing on his own part. And so sometimes we suffer because of our own sins. Sometimes good people suffer because of the sins of others. And then third is sometimes we suffer just because of factors that are beyond our control. The world exists, and there are natural laws that exist in this world, and these things, for example, just think about cancer. Now, how many people, how many million, just in America alone, how many millions of people, are suffering and dying of cancer? Now, sometimes people suffer with cancer because of their own doing. They might smoke 2 or 3 packs of cigarettes a day. They may get mouth cancer from chewing tobacco or snuff or whatever. They've contributed to, but a lot of people die of cancer that live clean lives. Think about a friend of mine, and his mother was I won't call her a health nut, but she's a health nut. And but she ate a very strict clean diet. She exercised, and yet she got pancreatic cancer, and she died in pretty short order. And so, but she wasn't, it was just something that was beyond her control. Even in my own family, there are some in my family who have what we call a cancer gene, and we learned this because my grandfather, my grandpa, and his brothers, many of his brothers had cancer, and then many of their sons had cancer, and so we ended up in a trial type study. I believe it was MD Anderson, and a lot of us were tested. Now, I tested negative for the cancer gene, but others in my family who are younger than me tested positive, and could either suffer themselves or pass that gene on to their own children. It was something that was good to know, but that's a factor really that's beyond our control, And so, sometimes our health matters are they're genetic, they're again from factors outside of our control, or other factors outside our control, and so it's just that there are laws of nature, biology, etc., chemistry that can be brought together and cause us difficulty. Then you have nature, just natural disasters. We lost some of our brethren up in Tennessee a year or so ago because of a tornado, and young family was killed, and those types of things happen with too much regularity, and Matthew 8:23-26 talks about there was a storm on the Sea of Galilee, but now nobody was harmed in that storm. But the point is that a storm on the Sea of Galilee was basically a common occurrence, and while no one was harmed or suffered in that particular case, many certainly would have suffered in other cases. So in where we live in Alabama, and here where I am right now in Arkansas, tornadoes are a real factor. In other places along the coasts, hurricanes or typhoons, earthquakes, volcanoes. There's so many factors in nature that are just a part of the existence of the world, which ultimately the world became the way it is because of sin. But these are factors that are beyond our control. Accidents. Good people get hurt in accidents, and nobody's at fault. Nobody's to blame. Just freak accidents or common accidents, automobile accidents. Things of that nature. And people say, well, why does God allow those things to happen? But think about what kind of world would we live in if God intervened in every single case where an innocent person was about to get hurt. I mean, the world would be absolutely chaotic. I mean, you couldn't. It's almost like you couldn't count on anything, and it just. I mean, cars just stopping. Planes, freezing in the sky, or whatever you might think about. Nobody. I don't think anybody want to live in a world that where God intervened in every single case. To me, it would seem so chaotic. It would almost basically be unlivable. And so there are a lot of factors that are beyond our control. But one thing I would mention in this respect is something we talk about quite a bit, and that's the idea of karma. There is no such thing as karma. Karma is if you do bad things will happen to you. And yet Job said that's not true, and Job said it 4,000 years ago, and David said it 3,000 years ago, and Jeremiah said it 2,600 years ago. So it's not true that when you do bad things will happen to you. Sometimes it's true, but it's not the rule. And so, but we like to think about karma, and I think we do it playfully. At least I do it playfully. You see people doing things that you don't like, and then something bad happens. I'll just give you kind of an innocent example. I don't like to see people kneel for the national anthem, and every team that I saw in the opening day of the basketball tournament that kneeled got boat raced right out of the tournament, except for Florida. They kneeled, but they won because the other team, both teams kneeled, so somebody had to lose. And then Florida went on into the next round and got beat by like a 15 seed. I know that doesn't mean anything to a lot of you, but you think, wow, karma. Kneel for the national anthem, get boat raced out of the tournament, and get sent home early. Well, that's not true. Those teams got beat because the other team was better than them on the basketball court. But those are the kind of things we think about when we think about karma. You do something, but it always works. What about the people who think it's good to kneel? The people think it's good to kneel for the national anthem. So karma won't work. Karma is when somebody does something I don't like, and then something bad happens to them. I like to think it's karma, but there is no such thing as that. But a lot of people believe in karma. A lot of people believe in what we call fate, that things are just destined or predestined to happen no matter what. We've got to get those things. We've got to get those things out of our minds. There is no such thing. There is no such thing as fate or fatalism. There is no such thing as karma. And then as we close, I think about some things with regard to bad things and suffering. And think about, do we really want to understand everything about suffering? Where would be, for example, what would happen to our ability to empathize with people if we understood everything about suffering and why everything happened the way that it did? I've got dear friends who've just suffered incredible tragedies in their lives, and we want to be sympathetic. We want to be empathetic. Sympathetic means that you've suffered the same thing, therefore you can understand how they feel. Empathy means I haven't suffered what you're suffering, and yet I want you to understand that I hurt because you hurt. And I don't want to be able to wrap my mind around everything. I don't think it'd be a good thing. Think about if we knew all these things, we would lose our ability to be empathetic. And by the way, sometimes bad things happen and we don't know why. There is a reason why, and we don't know it. But if we did know it, then we would fail to sympathize or empathize with those who are suffering. And so, I really don't want to wrap my head around all that. But I was thinking about. I told you a little bit ago, we're going to look at two passages. Think about two passages. I was talking to a young lady in Jacksonville, Alabama, just a few years ago, and we were studying one night late. I was staying at the Hampton there, and she was working the front desk, and we'd kind of developed a friendship because I'd spent a lot of time there, and I try to get to know people wherever I am, especially if I'm going to be there a few days. And we were talking, and she had a hard time. She didn't disbelieve in God, but her faith was faltering. And one of the things that caused her faith to falter was that her grandmother had been a church-going, daily Bible reading, praying, community servant, family servant. And she suffered. This girl told me, she said, my grandmother suffered terribly with cancer. She was in great pain. She suffered for a long time. Her death was extremely, extremely difficult. And she said, and my grandpa, in other words, the husband of this grandma, and my grandpa lived his whole life and never went to church. He cursed, he smoked, he drank, and he died in his sleep. She goes, and that just doesn't seem right to me. And I understand that. But that was a problem for her, that somebody that she understood to be a good person, somebody that she knew was trying to serve God to the best of their ability, had suffered an extremely long and painful death, while somebody who didn't give God a second thought got to die in his sleep. And that's exactly it's exactly what David said there in verse 4 of Psalm 73. There are no pangs, P-A-N-G-S. There is no pangs in their death. And then in Job 21:13, they spend their days in wealth and in a moment go down to the grave. In other words, they die in their sleep. And while these two events were driving, this young woman was allowing these things to drive her away from God. She should have used them to allow them to draw her closer to God. But again, because she thought she ought to be able to understand these things, it was a problem for her. And I interestingly enough, I still have the notebook and all the notes that I took the night that she and I studied, just a page full of notes. And something happened, and she didn't go back to work on the night that she was supposed to. And then I left, and I've never seen her again. But I've kept that legal pad and all the notes and all the things that she said, and I've studied it, and I tried to help me to help others answer these questions. And so, I hope that some of the things we've talked about today have been helpful to you. It's always good to be with you. Always appreciate those that watch the live stream, those that watch after the fact. And if the Lord wills, this coming Sunday morning we'll be live streaming at 10 o'clock. Obviously, if you're there at Burleson, we expect to see you there. But if you're at other places, perhaps where you attend is not meeting, or you have the opportunity to join us, we'd appreciate that. And we always appreciate all the encouraging comments that we receive. So with that, I will bid you a good day or a good evening. And again, appreciate you joining with us in this study. And until next time, God bless you, and have a great day and a great rest of your week.